first thing I want to talk about here while this isn't working is Jackson County general fund revenue losses. And a lot of people know about the loss of timber revenue to the county. I don't think they know how significant it is, because each year we get an explanation from Congress about how they passed another reauthorization and things are fine. I think what most of the public doesn't understand is, even though they passed a reauthorization, it's been so diminished that the amount of funding we get as compared to what we based our services on, and especially when our permanent rate limit was set, is nowhere near the necessary funding we need to operate our budget. As I said, this year we netted $3.5 million. At the peak, between our general fund and Title II and III revenue, we were netting about $19 million. So I want to kind of explain the loss in revenue, and this is specific to the general fund. Essentially, the county operates very well in our dedicated funds. We carry fund balances in each of those funds, and we don't have a lot of problems. We have minor adjustments through those. The general fund, which really goes to support a lot of public safety in our county and our libraries, is really where we struggle to have enough revenue to operate county services. So first thing I want to talk about, if you go back to 2006-07, which essentially I call the peak of the subsidy payments, at least since I've been here. Harvey may have a different amount depending on if you want to go back to when I was in high school or not. But in this case, we lost $15.6 million in general fund support, $3.4 million in Title II and Title III. The reason why I put that up there, although it's dedicated revenue to be used on O&C and Federal Forest Service lands, in our budget it goes a lot towards public safety, specifically our community justice program, who does a lot of thinning and brushing in our forest, to our sheriff's office, who does many search and rescue activities. We're not going to be able to stop doing search and rescue when someone's lost in our county. And so these Title II and Title III funds have replaced the need to use general funds. When these are gone, the burden falls on the general fund. So I include them because of that as a significant revenue toward the general fund, even though they are for use on federal lands. Just as a side note, and the reason why I put the asterisk here is I'm not going to include this in the total of loss to the general fund, but we also lost $4 million a year to our road fund. Here's some other things that have affected us. We have about 100, and let me preface this by saying, there are some people who will critique this information down to the last cent. I have rounded these numbers, and they are approximates. They're done that way on purpose to simplify the message I'm trying to deliver. So the numbers won't match exactly because, as I said, I've rounded them. And when you round, especially when you're talking about money, it makes a big difference. So we had about $170 million portfolio. We'll drop down to about $150 in the coming year. That's down. The amount of money we're investing is down about $20 million. At the peak, we were earning about 5.2% interest. Now we're down to about 1.4%, so down 3.8%. If you look at the peak, then if you take the 170 at the 5.2%, we were earning about 8.84 million a year. Now we're down around 2.1 million a year. That means we've lost $6.74 million a year in interest income. $6.74 million would balance our budget, operating wise. However, it wouldn't balance the general fund, because of that 6.74 million, only about half of it goes to the general fund and half of it goes out to dedicated funds. But we've lost $3.3 million in interest income to the general fund. Property tax base reduction, our average peak in growth was actually 5.3%. You heard me say Measure 50 set a limit at 3% growth, and that's true. The reason why we had a peak of 5.3 is new construction coming onto the rolls in addition to the growth of existing properties. Now it's 0% from what we budgeted last year. Let me clarify before the assessor jumps up and says that I'm wrong, that we are seeing a recovery in the property tax base, so we do expect a return in growth. However, it's 0% from what we budgeted last year. Last year, we over budgeted what we expected it to be. So that means this year it comes in at 0%. So that's down 5.3%. So when you look at what we'll be assessing, approximately $31.58 million in the current year, tax-based revenue for fiscal year 13-14. That still has yet to be determined, but I'm using this number for purposes of the argument. That means that we've lost about $1.68 million in revenue. We've had some changes in state law that have affected funding or changes in the way the state delivers revenue to the counties. One of the biggest ones is in our assessment department. The county assessment function funding assistance grant, called the CAFA grant, was about 32% of the budget. Now it's about 17%, so it's down about 15%. That's $690,000 that the general fund has to support that department that used to be supported through this CAFA grant. House Bill, it's actually 2712. Gosh, man. I'm glad I'm catching all of these errors now. Impact to our justice court. Last year in August, I made a projection that was based on 1 month of a fiscal year, saying that our justice court would be short about $500,000 in revenue to match operating expenditures to revenues. In October, when I went to testify before the interim committee, I did another projection based on 3 months of revenues, and that number jumped from 500 to 700,000, what we would be short. No one really could project exactly how the bill would be impacted because there was no past experience in how the funds being distributed could impact our budget. Due in this year to the good work of the Sheriff's Office and our Justice Court, I think that we will be able to balance our budget, not because we didn't lose revenue, we did lose revenue, but because we've been able to reduce expenses on the Sheriff's side. The Sheriff's done some good work out in enforcing and the court's processing, especially in the month of February, many citations. So we'll be able likely to balance our budget. We're balancing it on our reduction in service that we purposely made to be able to balance the budget. And we can't do that year after year because it's a spiraling downward occurrence. But this was $700,000 in revenue, and it could be more before the end of the year unless the legislature fixes this. And Dennis Richardson and Peter Buckley are working very hard and are committed to reversing the negative revenue taking from the counties in this case. Our clerk recording fees from the peak are down about $750,000. We are seeing a little uptick in that, but I'm going back to the peak here to show you cumulatively what all these impacts have meant. And community development fees, I think I told you in the budget it's about $755,000. Once again, this is a rounded number, $800,000, just for purposes of displaying the. So when you add all of this up, and I put the ONC Secure Rural Schools Act up top there at $19 million with an asterisk. That asterisk is because it does include that Title III. I explained to you why I included that. We lost $19 million there. Interest income, 3.37. Property tax base, 1.68. State law changes, 1.39. And economic impacts, 1.55. That actually comes up to 26.99 million, but it's rounded to 27. So if you go back, say the year before I came to the county, the person in my job had $27 million more to propose a budget to you with to provide all of these services than I have today when I put together this budget based on this logic of these cumulative effects. That's a lot of money when you look at our total property tax base is $31 million. I mean, that comes close to being $2 per thousand of a tax base that we've lost in revenue to be able to deliver services. Talk a little bit after that great news about where we stand today. I always have to do this part first. They're going to move in one at a time. So you've heard me talk about operating and non-operating revenue. Operating revenue is the kind of revenue that we like. We like operating revenue because it's constant and predictable. It's how we fund services. Our property tax base we can expect every year to receive. We can expect that if we spend it to hire deputy sheriffs, we can continue to employ those deputy sheriffs, or to fund library services, we can continue to fund those library services. Non-operating revenue, that's what I talked about, that we use for capital projects and we don't use for delivering services because they're one-time revenues, essentially. They're fund balances that we underspent, we got to carry over for a year. They're reserves and windfalls, and they can't be depended on into the future. A lot of times the public would like us to treat them as if they're operating revenues so we don't have to cut services. But what that does is make the cliff higher that we're going to eventually fall off of. So we have, with the exception of funding libraries, not used non-operating revenues in any dependable manner to fund services. So you heard me mention the word dedicated. So there's dedicated operating revenue and dedicated non-operating revenue. Dedicated is for a specific purpose. It comes to us under contract usually or intergovernmental agreement. It requires us to use that funding for a specific purpose, or it's guided by state law or federal law. For example, our airport with FAA grant assurances say you have to use those in the development of our airport. We can't take them and add library hours or take them and hire more district attorneys. We have non-dedicated. Non-dedicated is also one of our favorite terms when you look at your ability to impact services in the county. We really like non-dedicated operating revenues. That's what our general fund is. That's where you get to decide where the money gets spent. It's not directed. And as I said, purpose of use is discretionary. This is where you have the most latitude. Unfortunately, it's our smallest pot of money. So this is what it looks like when you put it up on a graph. The red and blue are all dedicated, meaning you have very little control over where that money gets spent. So if you look, that's about 75% of the budget. The red is operating revenue. In other words, it's coming in each year and we're spending it on services. The blue are the fund balances that those dedicated departments carry. The orange and green are our non-dedicated operating revenue for orange and our non-dedicated non-operating revenue. In other words, the green is our rainy day fund, right? It's not being replaced each year. It's a balance that we carry. So a lot of people are often shocked when I say this. If you really look up there, when you're deciding what you're going to spend money on for services, you make the decision on 12% of the budget. So on a $301 million budget, you're making $35 million in decisions because everywhere else it's directed or dedicated.